Welcome students to Unit 7, Social Cognitive Theories of Learning. This lecture will help you understand social cognitive theory and will cover the following topics. What is social cognitive theory? Bandura's social cognitive theory of learning. Milgram's experiment on obedience and authority. Implications for society and implications for the classroom. As a quick review, we've been learning a number of different types of theories in this course. To date, we've learned about cognitive learning theories, which focus on how children and adults learn. We've also focused on social emotional theories that focus on how children and adults develop into social beings with healthy or unhealthy emotions and social relationships. We've learned about moral development theories, which focus on how children and adults develop moral principles. Last unit, we learned about behavioral learning theories, which focus on the ways that pleasurable or unpleasurable consequences change individuals' behaviors over time. Now we're adding a new type of theory, a social cognitive theory, which will focus on how we learn from others by observing. When you study social cognitive theories, you're also thinking about some big questions. Consider the following. Do we learn by watching others? Does watching others influence our behavior? Do we conform to authority figures? Does watching violent media affect people's behavior overall? Let's get started. We'll start with the theorist Albert Bandura, who came up with the idea of social cognitive theory. He was a Canadian psychologist who taught at Stanford University, and he was known for the development of social cognitive theory of learning. Interestingly, he was the fourth most cited psychologist of all time, and he just recently passed away. Bandura's early work was grounded in the behavioral principles of reinforcement and punishment. So he studied Skinner's operant conditioning theory as well as Pavlov's classical conditioning theory. He thought they were correct in terms of reinforcement increasing a behavior and punishment decreasing a behavior, but he thought there was more to it than that. He added a focus on learning from observing others. At that time, he started calling his theory social learning theory. Even later, Bandura focused on cognitive factors, such as beliefs, self-perceptions, and expectation. He changed the name of his theory to social cognitive learning theory. In the 1960s, Albert Bandura decided to conduct what's now become a seminal experiment called the Bobo doll experiment. You might remember Bobo dolls from your own childhood. It's a funny-looking clown doll. When you hit it, it pops back up. Albert Bandura recruited 36 children between the ages of 3 and 6. He divided them into 3 groups. He placed each child individually, one at a time, in a room. In the experimental group, the first group, an adult would enter the room and violently beat the Bobo doll. The child in each case was told to play with a different set of toys off to the side. In the second group, the adult would come in but not violently play. He or she would play passively with the doll. In the third group, or the control group, there was no adult coming in. After 10 minutes, each child was escorted to another room with a set of toys and another Bobo doll, and then left alone. Unbeknownst to the child, they were being observed through a one-way mirror. Observers were looking to see how the children would play with the toys. Would they play more violently if they had been exposed to violence? Not surprisingly, it was found that the children who had been exposed to violence played much more violently with the toys when they were left on their own. This experiment has been repeated over and over with many different ages. There are some criticisms of the experiment. Selection bias. In other words, with such a limited sample, were the children somehow possessing of characteristics that made them more violent or less violent? Another criticism is that the children may have been motivated by a desire to please the adults rather than by any inherent violent tendencies. Third, children were too young and their brains were unformed. We're still not sure how this affected the experiment. And fourth, was it ethical to do this experiment? Regardless, partly out of this experiment came the social cognitive theory of learning, which states we learn by watching others because our behaviors are reinforced. Bandura said that there are three types of reinforcement. Like Skinner, he believed that there was direct reinforcement. This is when you're doing something and you're directly reinforced by someone else. So, for example, if you're a student and you're reinforced for staying in your seat and you're given a reward, that would be direct reinforcement. But then there's vicarious reinforcement, which is when you see others being reinforced for a particular behavior and you want to increase that behavior in the hopes that you'll be reinforced for it. Vicarious means not directly. So, for example, if I'm in a classroom and I'm a student and I'm talking and the teacher praises or reinforces the non-talking behavior of someone sitting next to me, I might stop talking in the hopes that I'll be rewarded too. That's vicarious reinforcement. The third type of reinforcement is self-reinforcement, when you learn to provide reinforcements to yourself. And this is really powerful because the student can control it and because it leads away from a dependence on external rewards. The student can then learn to value their own growing independence and competence. Now, all of these reinforcements may come from parents, from peers, teachers, counselors, and more. Bandura said that there were two types of learning taking place. Inactive, not I-N-A-C-T-I-V-E, but inactive, E-N-A-C-T-I-V-E, is learning by doing it yourself. You experience the consequences of your actions and you learn something. So if you're a skater and you're trying to learn a new move out on the ice and you fall down, then you're learning by doing. You learn from what your mistake is. If you're trying a math problem and you don't get the right answer, you're still learning by doing. Vicarious learning, on the other hand, there's that word again, vicarious, means learning by observing others. It can be powerful, but you must focus your attention, construct images in your mind about what you're seeing, remember what you're seeing, analyze what you're seeing, and make decisions that affect learning. Let's talk about that in a little more detail, the elements of observational learning. In order for anyone to learn anything, first they must pay attention. If you're distracted and you're looking around the classroom, chances are you're not learning. Rehearsal is the second element. We retain something by practicing it or mentally rehearsing it. The third element is production. We must practice it so much that we make it smooth. And then the fourth element is motivation and reinforcement. We must be motivated to reproduce the behavior. It's not enough just to learn it. We must be able to do it. If we believe we will be rewarded in some way, we are more motivated to reproduce that behavior. So that's where reinforcement comes in. Reinforcement can take many forms. You'll remember that in operant conditioning, reinforcement serves to increase the incidence of a behavior, and it can take many forms. It could be, for example, an external reward, such as an ice cream. It could be an internal reward, such as that feeling when you accomplish something and you glow with pride. Now I want to pivot slightly and talk about a little bit of a different topic. The role of authority. When we observe others and we watch someone that we believe has a lot of authority, does it make more of an imprint? Are we more likely to follow the lead of others that we view as authority figures? So here are some questions to consider. What role does authority play in picking up behaviors as we watch others? For example, do we do things we would not normally do if we watch others who are authority figures? An extreme example is this. What would you do if you were placed in a situation where an authority, for example, a Nazi soldier, told you to torture a prisoner? Most of us probably think we would not do that. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of studies on the concepts of obedience and authority. His experiments involved instructing study participants to deliver increasingly high voltage shocks to an actor in another room who would scream and eventually go silent as the shocks became stronger. The shocks weren't real, but study participants were made to believe that they were. In the most well-known version of Stanley Milgram's experiment, the 40 male participants were told that the experiment focused on the relationship between punishment, learning, and memory. The experimenter then introduced each participant to a second individual, explaining that this second individual was participating in the study as well. Participants were told that they would be randomly assigned to the role of teacher or learner. However, the second individual was an actor hired by the research team, and the study was set up so that the true participant would always be assigned to the teacher role. During the study, the learner, or the actor, was located in a separate room from the teacher, who was the real participant, but the teacher could hear the learner through the wall. The experimenter told the teacher that the learner would memorize word pairs and instructed the teacher to ask the learner questions. If the learner responded incorrectly to a question, the teacher would be asked to administer an electric shock. The shock started at a relatively mild level, 15 volts, but increased in 15-volt increments up to 450 volts. In actuality, the shocks were fake, but the participant was led to believe they were real. Participants were instructed to give a higher shock to the learner with each wrong answer. When the 150 shock was administered, the learner would cry out in pain and ask to leave the study. He would then continue crying out with each shock until the 330-volt level, at which point he would stop responding. During this process, whenever participants expressed hesitation about continuing with the study, the experimenter would urge them to go on with increasingly firm instructions, culminating in the statement, "You have no other choice, you must go on." The study ended when participants refused to obey the experimenter's demand, or when they gave the learner the highest level of shock on the machine, 450 volts, which in normal terms would be fatal. Milgram found that participants obeyed the experimenter at an unexpectedly high rate. 65% of the participants gave the learner the 450-volt shock. Some participants said they would refund the money they were paid for participating because they felt so guilty. Today, the Milgram experiment is widely criticized on both ethical and scientific grounds. However, his conclusions about humanity's willingness to obey authority figures remain influential and well known. What can we learn from Bandura and Milgram's work that we can apply to the classroom? First, we learn that we copy behavior quickly and easily by observing others. Watching others is a powerful way for us to learn. The more we are reinforced, the quicker our behavior changes. And that kind of reinforcement, remember, can be inactive or it can be vicarious. We often submit to authority. We often don't want to make waves. Some of these experiments were dark, but we can use these conclusions in the classroom in a positive way to manage behavior and motivate learners. Some implications and strategies from the classroom that flow from these ideas are: we can use modeling to teach content, skills, and behavior in the classroom. Modeling is when you stand in front of the class and you talk through what you're thinking, or you talk through the steps to do something. For example, if you are teaching students how to tie their shoes, then you could model the steps for them. If you're teaching them how to solve an advanced algebra equation on the board, you can do a talk aloud and model how to solve those steps. Just like with operant conditioning, we want to reinforce desirable behavior, either inactively or vicariously. So whereas Skinner said we need to reinforce directly, inactively, Bandura added the component of indirect reinforcement or vicarious reinforcement. For example, if you have a student who is getting out of his seat, you can turn to the next student and say, I really like how you're staying at your seat and remaining on task, to a different student, to encourage that original student to remain in his or her seat. Again, you can do think alouds when you model good behavior. These are just thinking aloud and talking about what you're thinking so students understand the thought process. You can read about and discuss good models of good behavior. You can teach students that it's okay to go against the crowd, especially if it's harmful for them to go along with the crowd. You can maintain a safe classroom with clearly defined and fairly administered consequences. You can patrol the hallways, cafeteria, and bus stations. Bandura's ideas also have implications for bullying. It's a myth that bullies are unhappy and suffering themselves. Recent research has revealed that bullies actually bully to gain status or power over others. Others watch bullies and copy them, hoping to gain status or power themselves, or at least to avoid being bullied. So students are watching the bullies, and they're learning vicariously that if I do this, if I copy that behavior, then I'll be okay. I'll gain status. People respect the bully, they'll respect me. So do you see Bandura's theory at work here? Bandura's theory may also help us think of strategies that work to prevent bullying. As a teacher, you should have zero tolerance for bullying by providing clearly communicated rules and consequences. Take the focus off the bullies and provide reinforcements for good behavior. Provide good role models for good behavior and standing up for what is right. And as I mentioned on the last slide, patrol your classroom and the hallways and the bus stations looking for bullying behavior. Here's a summary of what we've learned in this lecture. Social cognitive theories focus on how we learn from others by observing. Albert Bandura developed a social cognitive learning theory after viewing young children interact violently with Bobo dolls. Bandura's theory extended the theory of operant conditioning and stated that while rewards and punishments help shape behavior, the rewards and punishments don't have to directly impact the individual. Milgram's experiment showed that we are wired to deeply respect and obey authority. The combination of Bandura's theory and Milgram's experiment leads us to understand that classroom modeling is a powerful strategy for learning. This theory explains bullying and provides strategies to prevent bullying. Thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed this lecture.